Welcome back to Lesson 2. Last class we talked about King David and the beginning of the kings in Israel. Today we're going to look at King Solomon, who started off great, ended up being a corrupt king of Israel. Here in the picture you have the famous dispute that showed the wisdom of King Solomon. Because if there was one thing that Solomon was known for, it was his wisdom as a judge and as a philosopher. So these two women, each of them had a child. And one night, one woman rolled over and suffocated her child, woke up, realized that her child was dead, switched it out with the other baby. When the other woman woke up and saw that the dead baby in her arms, she knew that was not her child. So now they began to argue, and they would go before judges, and no judge knew how to determine who the baby belonged to, which mother was the true mother of the baby. So Solomon was the last. He's kind of like the Supreme Court. He was the last stop. He is the wisest man, so he would give the wisest judgment. So when the women bring him the baby, he makes the wise statement. He tells one of his servants, "Bring me a sword." So the man comes with a sword. He says, "Cut the baby in half. Each woman will get one half of the baby." That sounds pretty fair to me, although a little brutal. But of course, Solomon was smarter than that. He knew that he wasn't actually going to cut the baby in half. The real mother responded in horror and said, "Don't kill the child. Let the other woman have it, and we'll just leave it there." Solomon knew that the real mother would respond in that kind of way. So when he saw the sincerity in this woman's face and her plea, he knew that was the true mother of the child. That is one of just one of the stories that demonstrates the wisdom of Solomon. Let's begin. Before we talk about King Solomon in particular, I want to show you this chart, which shows that there's a huge difference. There's a huge change in the way that Jews worshipped between Sinai and Zion, between Moses' worship and the worship that we saw in the temple. So at Sinai, you had the tabernacle, basically just a large tent to house the Ark of the Covenant. At Zion, which is the mountain on which the temple was built, you had no longer just a movable tent, but you had an actual stable temple, and it was the one and only temple of Jewish worship. Second, at Sinai, the worship of the animal sacrifices was silent. There was no music, there was no singing. At Zion, in the temple, you had David separated many of the Levitical tribe into different groups who would sing. So you had a lot of music in the temple. We still do this today. When we go to church at Mass, we have the Psalms sung between the readings. David was the traditional author of about half of the Psalms, so he constructed many of these Psalms to be sung in the temple at Sinai. This was an exclusively Jewish worship. Non-Jews were not allowed to worship or sacrifice in the tabernacle. When you move to Zion, Mount Zion, on which the temple was built, now you have the temple, which had three parts. In the inner, it's called the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the temple, only the high priest could go once a year. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was. In the inner sanctum, you had the place where Jews could go. Around that, you had the outer court of the temple, which was inclusive of Gentiles. So a lot of people from all over the world would come to Jerusalem, come to Zion, to worship the God of Israel in the temple. So we have a more inclusive worship of God here, which is what God wanted all along when he made Israel, right? He wanted Israel to be a kingdom of priests, going, leading, and teaching the people. So we're very, very close to God's original plan for Israel here at Zion. Of course, it didn't last long because of King Solomon, as we'll see. The doctrine at Mount Sinai is summarized in the Torah, which is, of course, the Ten Commandments, but it's also Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those 5 books comprise the Torah. When we move from there to Zion, we have the wisdom literature. We're going to talk about the difference between those in the coming slides. And finally, we have the sacrifice. The major sacrifice of the Sinai covenant was the sin offering because it was instituted after the golden calf. Israel was in a sinful state. The primary sacrifice of the covenant at Zion is called the Torah sacrifice, called thanks, or Eucharistia in Greek. This would be a sacrifice of bread and wine. So we still preserve this sacrifice today in the Eucharist. We even have the same name, Eucharist, for it, which is why the word Eucharist means thanksgiving. Last time we looked at the covenant God swore to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Once God swears these promises to David's son, that he will build a temple. His throne will be established forever, and he will be called the Son of God. Once David hears these things, he rejoiced, and it says, King David went in and sat before the Lord and said, Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house, that you have brought me this far? And yet this was a small thing in your eyes, O Lord God. Thou hast spoken also of my servant's house for a great while to come. He's saying, look, who am I? I was just some shepherd, and you're treating me so well. And not only me, but you are going to make my name great and my son forever, and has shown me a law for mankind, or a Torah for Adam, O Lord God. And what more can David say to you? For you know thy servant, O Lord God. Because of your promise and according to your heart, you have wrought all this greatness to make it known. Okay, so what is being made known? He says, you have shown me a Torah, or a law for mankind. This is important because at Sinai, Moses was given a Torah for Israel. He was given a law for the 12 tribes. What David is saying is, through this covenant, you're not just giving me a law for the Israelites. You have literally given me a law for all mankind. So what we're seeing is, this is what God's original plan was. You were going to bring blessing upon all nations. And David is saying, you're giving this to me. Who am I? I was just some shepherd, and yet you're giving me this great law. So what exactly is this law? Well, let's look in the next slide. Solomon took the throne when he was a very young teenager. Because of his youth, he was uncertain about his ability to lead the people of Israel well. So God asks Solomon, what is the one thing that you desire? And Solomon says, wisdom to lead your people, O Lord. And this is what the Torah, or the law for mankind, is, the wisdom literature. So these 4 books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Wisdom, these are books traditionally ascribed to the pen of King Solomon. Solomon made peace with many nations and taught them the wisdom of God. So when we read through the wisdom literature, it's not like the law of Leviticus and the laws of Deuteronomy. Those were strictly laws for the Israelite people at a specific time. The laws that we find in the wisdom literature, those are for all times, all people, and all places. This is the law for mankind that David said that God had showed to him, which is why we can still read these books like Proverbs, and we can discover wisdom to lead our lives well now. Whereas if you read Deuteronomy, well, I don't really have a whole lot of use for foreign slave wives or going for harem warfare. Those things have been made obsolete. You might remember this, you might not. Way back when we talked about Moses, I mentioned that Moses had set down laws for kings. He knew there would be kings in Israel because God promised to Abraham that there would be kings. So in Deuteronomy 17, Moses tells the kings that you need to make a copy of this law and meditate on it every night. So what exactly did this law say? I'll read it to you. Moses says, and he who sits on the throne and of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law from that which is in charge of the Levitical priests, right? He'll make a copy. Okay, well, what does the copy of this law tell him to do? The king must not multiply horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to multiply horses. You shall not return there again. You shall not multiply wives for yourself, lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he greatly multiply for himself silver and gold. So here we see a command. He is forbidden amassing or gathering a large number of these 3 things to himself: horses, wives, and wealth. You can probably understand why he's not supposed to get too much gold, because that might make his heart corrupt against the Lord. You might see why he's not supposed to have too many wives, because again, that'll turn his heart away. But why horses? Well, there's 2 reasons. One, horses were used in warfare, and God is not calling the nation of Israel to be a nation of warfare. The second reason is, and this is what was said in the Bible, you shall not make your people go back to Egypt to get them. Well, we're going to find out that Solomon really did all these 3 things. How exactly did Solomon fail in these 3 things? Well, 1 Kings 10, we see Solomon collects 666 talents of gold in 1 year. Well, that number is important in the Bible. It's used twice, once in the book of Revelation and once here. We'll talk more about that number when we get to the book of Revelation. But suffice it to say, that is a very, very large amount of gold that he collected in 1 year in taxes. Solomon imported horses not just from Egypt, but from all over the place. Deuteronomy specifically told him not to import horses from Egypt, but he did do that also. In fact, he was so well known for horses, he had whole cities whose only purpose was to be stable cities, meaning to contain his horses. Lastly, King Solomon was famously known for his 700 wives and 300 concubines. Concubine meaning a slave wife. And it says these wives turned his heart away from God. Well, that's for sure. In chapter 11 of 1 Kings, it says, Now Solomon loved many foreign women, the daughter of Pharaoh, and Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with. So Solomon was breaking the law of Leviticus by entering into marriage with women of some of these tribes. Why would Solomon have so many wives in the first place? Many of these wives would be peace treaties with other nations. Solomon was known as the king of peace, who made peace with many nations. The number 700 is probably just symbolic of he had wives from all over the world, 7 being that number of perfection, and 100 also. Because Solomon failed to keep these 3 laws, he's punished according to the law of Deuteronomy. And I'll read to you the punishment. It says, Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, Since this has been your mind, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and I'll give it to your servant. Yet, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear it all away, but I will give 1 tribe to your son for the sake of David my servant. God tells him, yes, I'm going to take the kingdom away from you, but I will leave 1 tribe to your son. Why will he do that? Because he made a promise to David that the son of David will rule on the throne forever. So he's going to leave the smallest amount possible, 1 tribe, to the son of Solomon. That's where we will pick up next time.